Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and welcome to the weekly HWbot score roundup number 13. As every week, there's been a bunch of epic scores uploaded to HWbot, and we're going to be taking a look at some of them. Like the video always ends up being way too damn long, so we'll see if I can fix that this time. And yeah, let's get right into it, starting off with Bisso's Unigen Superposition 1080p Extreme single GPU world record using, of course, the RTX 3090 Kingpin Edition, producing a score of 19,096 points on liquid nitrogen, 2820 core clock, 1481 on the memory. Yeah, 10900K at 5.4 gigahertz, 10 cores, 10 threads, because this is not a CPU benchmark, it's a GPU benchmark. So, I guess in a way you could argue, I think this is just leftover settings, though at the same time, like, hyperthreading does, this doesn't seem to really run at frame rates high enough to justify disabling hyperthreading, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Like, fun fact, if you don't need hyperthreading, it actually just hurts your single core performance. Not very much, but it does. So, and also for Port Royal, it's standard to run without the hyperthreading. So I guess these are sort of just leftover settings, and this is a very similar benchmark to Port Royal in that there's no CPU subtest. So, why would you give up any amount of single-threaded CPU performance for the sake of having hyperthreading, especially on a 10 core? Like, that's more than enough cores to do basically anything as is. The motherboard is an EVGA Z590 Dark. Memory doing 4800 CL16. Samsung BDI, of course, just 16 gigs of it, so single rank NIMs. And yeah, here's the setup. GPU's on LN2, CPU on water cooling. Knock to a fan sandwich on the VRM of the card to keep it cool, because 3090s on LN2, well, they pull a lot of power at ambient. They pull more power when they're on liquid nitrogen. So yeah, the power delivery does get quite hot. And I'm not actually sure how long the superposition benchmark is, but if it's anything like Unigen Heaven, it's probably one of the longest 3D benchmarks there is. Because that was like 4 minutes, like that if I remember correctly, was like 4 minutes of sustained load, whereas something like a 3D mark is a couple, like you have like 45 seconds first test, and there's a loading screen, then another 40 seconds on the second test. So yeah, anyway, there's not really too much to say at this point about Bisso's RTX 3090, because it's featured almost every week, doing the same thing every week, which is taking the record in some GPU benchmark. So yeah, congratulations to him on cleaning up the leaderboards for everything for every benchmark where the 3090 is capable. And yeah, let's move on to the next score, which is Arsenino's Cinebench R20 32-core world record using a Ryzen Threadripper 3970X at 5.5 gigahertz on a Asus Zenith 2 Extreme motherboard. Unfortunately, we don't have any system pictures, but Threadripper on liquid nitrogen is intense. It pulls a stupid amount of power. It's annoying to work with. It has, like, the cold behavior is very unpleasant. I mean, the thing is, Threadripper, in my opinion, is unpleasant and ambient, and then on cold, it just kind of gets worse. Like, it just gets worse. And you can really see that here as we're looking at 3800, 14, 14, 14 on the memory. This is admittedly Cinebench, and Cinebench does not actually care about your memory settings much at all, but the uncore frequency is all the way down to 900 megahertz, so, and that is a big part of actually getting Threadripper CPUs to the actually just Zen CPUs in general, Ryzen 3000 series CPUs in general to the lowest possible temperatures, is actually running the Infinity Fabric at a rather low clock, because the Infinity Fabric just doesn't work properly at very low temperatures a lot of the time. And so, yeah, you end up with things like this where you're running like memory settings that are worse than what you would be able to run daily. But it doesn't matter because this is Cinebench R20, and all Cinebench R20 really cares about is that you have a massive CPU clock, and that's where giving up Infinity Fabric clock speed is so important, because if you can run those lower temperatures, that is where Ryzen gets all of its extra core clock from. Like, admittedly, you're also running more voltage, but the thing is, voltage scaling is directly tied to operating temperature, so the colder you can get the chip, the more voltage you can run into it, the higher the clock speeds you can achieve. And so, like, those things go hand in hand, right? Like, the colder the CPU is, even at the same voltage, that already boosts your clocks. And then you can raise the voltage and your clocks go up even more. And so, yeah, this 3970X is, absolutely flying, doing 5.5 gigahertz on all 32 cores, so with all 64 threads still enabled. Yeah, it's a real shame we don't have system pictures. That's the only thing I'm kind of disappointed with. But like, the score itself is insane. And yeah, literally the highest clocked 3970X to ever run Cinebench, because yeah, this is Cinebench. And actually, I want to see, like, the thing is, that is a very small frequency difference there, like 25, yeah, 27 megahertz. So yeah, on a score this big, like, it's not going to have that much impact. I think if we did the calculation, it would work out that it's like linear points to frequency scaling, because Cinebench mostly follows that rule of, like, you can take your score, divide it by your frequency, and then multiply it by the frequency you want to hit, and with all probability, you're going to get the score, like the score you want with that. So yeah, anyway, SafeDisk was able to run. Though I'm not sure if that version of CPU-Z was... no, it looks like SafeDisk was able to run his Infinity Fabric at a significantly higher clock speed, but, Cinebench R20. Cinebench R20 does not care about your RAM, especially on Ryzen CPUs. On Intel CPUs, the memory settings do have some effect on the various Cinebenches, but Ryzen, with its huge amount of L3 cache, just... Like, basically, AMD's whole design philosophy with Ryzen was, well, our memory controller is not just it. There's a limit to what you can do when you have, a separate die with the memory controller. So instead of trying to get more memory performance out of a very suboptimal memory design, it was just kind of like, well, what if we just didn't have to access the memory that often? How about we just put more cache on there? And so that's most of what makes Ryzen basically immune to memory settings in Cinebench. It just does not care, and it is very much just a clock speed test. And we can mostly see that here. If Arsenino is actually running 900 megahertz Infinity Fabric to get that 5.5 gigahertz out of the CPU, then like, his settings should be like his memory performance would be miles behind what, like, SafeDisk is running, but Cinebench runs out of the L3 cache, so that doesn't really affect it very much. So anyway, or more like runs almost entirely in the L3 cache, so you don't need a bunch of memory bandwidth to deal with it. So yeah, congratulations to Arsenino on pushing the 3970X to 5.5 gigahertz and taking the Cinebench R20 32 core record. Because that's insane. Like, these chips pull so much power, and yeah, like, Cinebench is also just like a clock speed test. So a very, very cool score. Yeah, also, these CPUs are just very hard to run in general, like, are also very fiddly to run. So even though it's like, oh, you don't need to worry about your memory settings too much, it's like getting these chips to these frequencies is very difficult. So a very impressive score. Congratulations to Arsenino on it. And let's move on to the next score, which is Brutex? I'm going to say Brutex. GPU Pi for CPU 1 billion. Fourth place on a Ryzen 3 5300G at 5.2 gigahertz. Now, the 5300G has been sort of all the rage in GPU Pi for CPU 1 billion in the quad-core rankings, because it just does so well in this benchmark. So it might be a bit weird that I'm featuring it, but, it's a fourth place finish in the overall rankings, which in and of itself is quite the achievement. well, there's only how many? There's only 550-300 Gs, but like still, um, a very solid score. But what's cool about this score is this is actually on a cascade phase like this is a phase change cooling system. Now, a cascade phase change just means that instead of having one refrigeration loop, you have a one phase change loop that's cooling another phase change loop, and then that one is either cooling the CPU, or potentially you can have like 3-stage cascades or 4-stage cascades, depending on how ridiculous you want to get with the design. But I believe this is just a 2-stage. I might be wrong about that, and I'm like guessing at that because it's running at minus 78 degrees Celsius. So yeah, like the cool thing is just like seeing a top 4 score in this benchmark on the 5300G. From what I've heard, the 5300G actually has a relatively warm cold bug, so it makes a lot of sense that we have a cascade phase change setup actually competing, well, not too far behind like full out LN2 scores, both in terms of just the score itself and the frequency. Right, this is 5.2 gigahertz, so really not that far off of the LN2 results. Because yeah, this cascade can go pretty damn cold, and unfortunately the CPU itself can't go much cold. Like won't really tolerate much more cold than I believe it's around minus 100. That these that 5300Gs like stop working properly. So yeah, it's like just like it's cool to see something other than LN2 at the top of the rankings for a benchmark for once. Well, actually, there's other CPUs where you also see phase change setups very, very highly ranked. But anyway, so yeah, cool cooling system. And then we've got the score itself, so 5.2 gigahertz on the CPU. And then just 3800 CL18 on the memory. I guess this is very much another one. I guess GPU Pi is another one of those benchmarks that just doesn't care that much about your memory settings. Which would make sense, because GPU Pi, even when it's running on GPUs, doesn't care about memory settings. Like, you can actually underclock your memory on a lot of GPUs in order to try get more core clock out of them, and GPU Pi will not, like, penalize you for losing memory speed. So, yeah, anyway, an awesome score here from Brutech on the 5300G. And so yeah, he gets into this week's roundup because, well, he made it all the way into 4th place in the quad core GPU Pi for CPU 1 billion rankings. So congratulations to him on that. And let's move on to the next score, which is Char 00750's Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion on a 5600X. So this is in the 6-core rankings. He managed to get 3rd place, and I still feel like the 5600X is the wrong CPU for this benchmark. Because 6-core, so the thing about Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion is this is a very, very heavy AVX workload, and it loves memory bandwidth. It's about as close as you're going to get to a stress test being a benchmark. And the end result of that is that on Ryzen chips, you end up running very normal memory settings, right? Like 1900, 1413, 1321 here. Though admittedly on liquid nitrogen, running those kinds of settings is a lot more difficult. Like at ambient, if your CPU can't do this, there's something wrong with your CPU or your motherboard. On liquid nitrogen, if you can't do this, that's actually kind of normal. Especially since this is also running the actual Infinity Fabric at 1900, or at least seems to be. So yeah, getting the memory clocked and the Infinity Fabric clocked this high on liquid nitrogen is actually very difficult. Similar to how like the exact same reasoning as on the Threadrippers, like the Infinity Fabric just doesn't really appreciate being very cold. Not even on the like 5600X and other well, basically all of the Ryzen CPUs that have a it's only the 2000 series that basically runs really well on liquid nitrogen, and then everything before that, like 1000 series was annoying, 3000 series, 5000 series also annoying. The Infinity Fabric just really doesn't appreciate the low temperatures. So that makes this very impressive in that he's actually running maxed out, like that's probably maxed out on liquid nitrogen at 1900 Infinity Fabric and 1900 on the memory. And then also, like, Y Cruncher is actually very stability sensitive, so yeah, a very, very hard benchmark. Then 5.7, well, almost 5.8 gigahertz on the CPU. So the CPU is also, really going very quickly. And he's probably not able to run it that cold just because of the requirement to actually run high, good memory settings, because Y Cruncher, yeah, it really loves memory performance. I'm actually surprised that he's not running dual rank, as that should help Y Cruncher quite significantly, and it is generally, like, I don't know if on liquid nitrogen it stops working, but at ambient, 1900, 14, 13, 13 should be no problem. And on liquid nitrogen, my understanding is that's primarily the FCLK. So if you get the FCLK up to 1900, I don't see a reason not to try, dual rank Samsung BDI for the memory configuration. But either way, Char is getting a very, very, solid score here out of the 5600X. However, the thing is, the reason I said that the 5600X is the wrong CPU for this benchmark is Y Cruncher uses AVX512 instructions when given a CPU that'll support them, like a 7800X or like any of the X299 6-core CPUs. And the thing about that is, the 5600X doesn't have AVX512 support, which is also why, like, a 5600X doing, almost 5.8 gigahertz is ultimately, like a second, actually, yeah, more than a second behind a 5 gigahertz 7800X. It also doesn't help that a 5600X only has 2 memory channels, whereas a 7800X has 4 of them. So a 7800X has significantly more memory bandwidth available to it, which is critical for Y Cruncher performance. And if the website loaded. And also on, 7800Xs, you can run pretty similar memory settings. Also, with the fact that you have 32 gigs of memory, you can actually run MaxMem in order to get, more aggressive memory settings working, because on Samsung BDI, as you start raising the voltage, it gets really unstable past a certain point. And so if you want to run Y Cruncher, you kind of, with MaxMem enabled, you really do need kind of a lot of RAM in order to actually still have enough RAM to run Y Cruncher, because it does require, I believe, at least 4 gigs of RAM in order to run. And so, which is actually a relatively high MaxMem setting. So, yeah. But still a very, very impressive score, especially considering, like, the CPU really isn't ideal for the Y Cruncher benchmark. So it's all that makes it all the more impressive that Char here got it all the way to 3rd place. And yeah, using the Gigabyte X570 AORS Master. And unfortunately, we don't have a system picture, so it's a bit of a shame that we can't see the setup, but still a very solid score. And congratulations to Char on the Y Cruncher Pi 6-core 3rd place. So yeah, let's move on to the next score, which is Unity of Saints Unigen Superposition Triple GPU 1080p Extreme. 3rd place on 3 R9 290Xs. These really seem to be the GPUs of choice for this benchmark. I wonder if this is actually because Fiji cards are worse for this benchmark, which seems unlikely because they are just... I really need to pull out my Fury X's and the Pro Duo and take Unigen Superposition for a spin, because I feel like that should be better than a 3 290Xs. But yeah, currently the triple GPU rankings for this benchmark are entirely dominated by, well, 290Xs, interestingly enough, as well as some 480s. And Unity of Saints here has managed to get the 3 cards running 1175, 1425. Apparently this was also a live stream, so you should actually check out his Twitch, because he does a lot of overclocking streams. He's much better at doing overclocking live streams than I am. So yeah, if you want to, have more overclocking streams to watch, I highly recommend that you check out his Twitch. And yeah, and this is running on a, 7940X, because there's kind of a limited number of platforms where you can actually run triple GPU setups, X299 being one of them, Threadripper being another, but Threadripper is really bad at GPU benchmarks because of Threadripper's memory controller is not only annoying to work with, it's also slower than the mainstream Ryzen memory controller, and the mainstream Ryzen memory controller wasn't great to begin with. So, you know, Threadripper, it's like, yeah, technically you can put 4 GPUs onto a Threadripper motherboard and enable Crossfire. However, it's expensive and actually really bad at 3D benchmarks in my experience. It's like, if you want to remove a bunch of GPU score, Threadripper is the quickest way to do it. And this benchmark doesn't have a CPU component, so a 7940X is more than enough to, feed the 290Xs here. And then you just need the PCIe lanes, which X299 has, since it has, what is it? I think it has 48 PCIe lanes off the top of my head. And you only need X8, 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 X8 in order to get, even quad GPU setups working. This obviously is a triple, so, you don't even need that many lanes, but you can't really run triple GPU on, well, there's exactly one X570 motherboard where you can do three-way crossfire off of the CPU lanes without having to go through the chipset, and going through the chipset, like, it does work, but it's a bad idea. And the thing is with 290Xs, these are PCIe 3.0 GPUs. So if you actually run them on a X570 Godlike, the only motherboard that actually supports triple GPUs directly off of the CPU, you end up with PCIe 3.0 X4 because there's only 16 PCIe lanes. So yeah, X299 is still relevant for big multi-GPU setups, mostly because AMD and Intel can't be bothered to put more PCIe lanes onto any of their more modern CPUs. So, yeah, but still a very cool, so that's why the 7940X is here. And then for the 290Xs themselves, I mean, 1175 on the core, 1425 on the memory. These cards run really hot. They pull a lot of power, and what's he cooling them with? They are apparently on water cooling, so that's a bit low. Is he seriously using Afterburner for this? Plus 50 core voltage? No, these are 290Xs, give them plus 200. Or more like, keep raising it until it as long as it scales, keep raising the voltage, unless it shuts down your power supply. Because, 290Xs do get extremely power hungry. So yeah, this is actually kind of tame settings for 290Xs, unless one of the cards is really, really bad, or one of them is like on air cooling. You never, like, maybe two of them are on water cooling. We unfortunately don't have a system picture. I guess I could have like pulled up the live stream and checked what the system looked like. Also, his memory settings are whack. That's 2416. This really looks like an afterthought type setup. So yeah, basically, if you have three 290Xs lying around, this is definitely and assuming you have a motherboard capable of actually running all three of them properly, this is definitely a benchmark worth checking out, because I guess I've heard apparently that the biggest problem with this benchmark is actually getting three-way to like run properly, because the benchmark apparently is weird about detecting multi-GPU setups, but yeah, still, like, I'm a huge fan of big multi-GPU setups. Just because they're so ridiculous, and also, like, well, mostly just because they're ridiculous. Like, totally impractical, but, so is liquid nitrogen. So big multi-GPU setups are sort of, to me, in that same kind of category. And yeah, so congratulations to Unity of Saints on figuring out how to get Unigine superposition to run. He has good efficiency, though. Like, his score is actually really good considering the settings that he's running. Though admittedly, there's not that many cards clocked this high. So maybe this is a lot more intense on the GPUs than what I'm used to, but on chilled water cooling, I'd expect to see at least 1200 on all three cards on the core. So then again, that's still... Well, no, it's on chilled water cooling. Like, assuming your power supply doesn't give up, you should be able to just mash more voltage into them. Unless your chiller is kind of small or something. No, even then, you just get more water, chill the water down, run the benchmark, wait for the water to cool down again. Like, you can just bench on, like, thermal inertia. For short, like, assuming the benchmark's... Well, no, even if the benchmark's long, you just, you just back off the clock so that you don't crash at the end of the benchmark when the water is too hot, but or too warm. It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of a, large amount of water by a small amount. So, yeah, even if the benchmark was several minutes long, like, you should be able to finish it with, like, if you started at 0, you should be able to still finish at, like, reasonable water temperatures. It shouldn't be like the cards will pull it up to 40 degrees in a couple minutes. It's like, you'd have to have very little water in the loop for that to be a problem. So, yeah, but, still a very, like, if nothing else, a very efficient result. I think he should really push it further. Like, this to me is like, the memory, a lot of the time you can't do anything about that on 290Xs. Like, a lot of them just suck at memory overclocking. A lot of them have LPWRAM. There's a connection between those two things. But yeah, the core clock would, like, unless one of the cards is, like, especially terrible, you really should be able to do 1200 plus on water cooling of any kind. Like, even if you zip tied AIOs to the cards, you should be able to do 1200 core if you give them enough voltage, which plus 50 millivolts just isn't. Yeah. But hey, still, third place in the triple GPU rankings, so congratulations to Unity of Saints on that. And let's move on to the next score, which is Salty Croissant's 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme with the 290X Lightning. First place in the R9 290X rankings. And yeah, running 1400 core, 1650 memory, which the thing, like, 290Xs, again, are just weird about the memory overclocking. 1650 is quite high for them. Like, there are some, like, cards that'll do like 1800 or something ridiculous like that, but if you can get 1650 out of a 290X, that's a good thing. That's a good memory overclock, because a lot of them will get stuck below that. But of course, this is a Lightning, so I really hope MSI didn't make any of these with LPWRAM. They did make a lot of them with terrible cores, though. Like, I actually have a 290X Lightning LE, which is like a light edition, which basically translates into binning reject. That card's horrible. Absolutely horrible. Luckily, I mostly bought it in order to get the heatsink for a good Lightning that I have, so it's kind of like, yep, I don't necessarily care too much. But, yeah, so 290Xs, you just don't expect to see super, like, massive memory overclocks, because, like, also you just have to consider these cards have an absolutely ridiculous memory system. 512 bits of, GDDR5 memory controller. Like, AMD's solution to, like, oh, we need more memory bandwidth was just make it even wider. And this is the limit for how wide you can make a GPU memory controller on GDDR5. Like, there's never been a card with a wider than 512-bit memory controller on a GDDR memory system. Obviously, HBM goes way wider than that, but that's a completely different format of memory, right? And that's really what it is about. It's just like, there's a limit to how many memory chips you can get to fit around the GPU core. Within a, also reasonable PCB design, and then just also your substrate has to have, all of the connections that you need to make for all those memory chips. So, yeah. But 1400 core, well, that's kind of what you'd expect from a chilled 290X. So 7 degrees Celsius idle. So not there are chillers out there which will go quite happily below 0. This does not seem to be one of them, or Salty Croissant just didn't want to deal with, a massive amount of condensation. One of the two. And this is a really cool part of the Lightning cards, is just MSI actually designed the heatsink so that you can use the, VR. Actually, I think if you got the full retail package for the 290X Lightning, you would actually get a special like VRM heatsink specifically for LN2 overclocking, so that you could have an LN2 pot, and this section for this area of the card would actually not be there anymore, and you would just have the VRM heatsink. So that's like, Lightning cards are awesome. It's a real shame that MSI eventually just completely like, well, first of all, they released a bunch of Lightnings that just kind of suck, and then they just stopped using the branding. So yeah, which I guess is better than just dragging the name through the dirt. Right, the 2080 Ti Lightning, I think it was, not really a Lightning. Yeah, Lightning in name only. This right here is a proper Lightning. But yeah, so 5900X on at 4.7 gigahertz, which isn't actually like, this is Firestrike Extreme, so the 290X isn't exactly producing a gigantic graphics score here. And so, you know, the 5900X is helping, but it's not like, say, if you were running Firestrike, where if you have several, like the weighting, the way the weighting works for the Firestrike benchmarks, or actually a lot of the 3D marks, is that the closer your GPU score gets to your CPU score, the more important it is to have a bigger CPU score. So if your GPU score is like 9,000 points, then yeah, 35,000 points or 40,000 points isn't going to make a gigantic difference. But certainly, you know, the 5900X does help, as it is one of the best CPUs for Firestrike. And yeah, and then like the main thing here is, though, the card is absolutely flying. Like, absolutely flying. 1400 core is like, that is like some serious cooling territory, right? Like, we have cards on LN2 doing 1435, and this is on chilled water cooling. We have a card doing 1400 on dry ice, and again, this is on chilled water cooling. So that is, I wonder how much voltage he ran through it, because I think Salty actually asked me about like, how much voltage can you give a 290X, and if I remember correctly, the answer I gave him was like, are you benching? Just raise it until it stops scaling. Well, it certainly looks like he did that, because yeah, the card, like, this is an insane clock, and yeah, a very, very impressive score to go with it. I'm assuming he also modded the memory timings. 1.45 core. That's not that high. Well, it depends where you're measuring. If that's 1.45 behind the core, that's actually very, very high. If that's 1.45 at the VRM, that's not really that high. If that's like 1.45 set in software, that's not really that high. Might rerun with more vCore. I think at this point it would be better to rerun with more cooling, but I mean, if it keeps scaling, why not? And then 0.95 volt rail modded. So this right here, a lot of the 28 nanometer AMD GPUs, once you start running a lot of voltage into them, they have a tendency to black screen, as in the display output driver just drops out. It doesn't necessarily mean that the card isn't rendering anything. It just means whatever it is managing to render, it doesn't output it to the screen, which is really fun, because you're running your benchmark and then it black screens and you get to sit there wondering, well, did it actually crash? Or is the benchmark running and the display driver on the card has decided to just not output a signal anymore? Usually you can tell by the coil whine. Like, if you hear a lot of coil whine, it's actually running the benchmark, though it also depends to some extent on the card. And this is actually one of the reasons I really like GPU, like the load indicators that you get on some of the AMD reference cards, is that you don't have to, like, because a lot of cards just from AMD just regular have these display dropout issues at high voltages. Is like, well, you don't have to wonder if like the benchmark is running, because you can just see the load indicator telling you, yes, the benchmark is running. But on 290Xs, you do not get that. So with these, you just kind of have to hope that, like, you know, well, either you mod the 0.95 volt rail and raise that voltage until the black screens stop occurring, or you just kind of hope that the thing is rendering and, you know, wait for the, like, just time the benchmark run so that, hey, at this point the benchmark should finish. Is the black screen gone yet? No. Well, then we should probably restart the system, which, not a very fun way to bench, but, you know, anything for high scores. Anything for high scores. So, congratulations to Salty on, like, the absolutely insane 290X overclock. Like 1400 on these things is just like you saw the rankings. Like that is an insane core clock to be running on a chilled card, because we have cards on LN2, not clocking as high. Admittedly, when they're run, well, some of them are doing over around 1600, but still 1400 without even getting liquid nitrogen is a very, very impressive core clock. So, I mean, it's not even on dry ice. Like it's on chilled water cooling. So this is not very cold whatsoever. Um, this card would be insane on liquid nitrogen. I hope Salty eventually gets to that point, of taking, because that might be like a 1600 plus card if he ever gets to run it on LN2. So yeah, congratulations to him on the score, and let's move on to the next score, which is Chipsy's 3D Mark Vantage performance with a GTX 690. So fastest GTX 690 to ever run a 3D Mark Vantage. Well, not really. Unfortunately, 3D Mark Vantage is one of those 3D Marks with a CPU score, and the GTX 690 is producing a high enough GPU score that you can seriously carry the card with a 5950X, but doing almost 5.2 gigahertz on a 5950X in and of itself is quite impressive on single stage phase change. And then I wonder if this is a more efficient cooling system than just using the stock air cooler. Because those heat sinks that are inside the 690, like, I'm pretty sure most of the surface area of those heat sinks is covered by the fan hub on those fans. So, and also those are, like, Noctua doesn't do anything higher than 3000 RPM, which isn't particularly fast. At the same time, that doesn't stop the 3000 RPM fans from being insanely loud. And, well, maybe this is a card that he got without the full heatsink assembly. Because 1120 on the core is... Oh, wait, is that 1120 base? No, that looks like it's 1120 boost. Yeah, for a Kepler card, that's kind of low. Like, if you just shove more voltage through Kepler cards, you should be able to do like 1300 on air cooling. Though I'm not sure how good the GTX 690 heat sinks are. They're probably terrible because it's basically a double-ended blower. And we all know how good blower heat sinks are at cooling things. They're not. Blower heat sinks are the design compromise focused entirely on getting a form factor instead of any level of performance. But yeah, so the clocks here on the GPU seem a bit low. The memory's flying though. 1802 on the memory is quite high. Yeah, like really 1200. Oh, I guess 690s. The thing is, the power delivery on 690s isn't even that bad. Like, it's not a GTX 590 where the VRM will blow up if you look at it wrong. Mostly because it's the same VRM as a GTX 5, like a very similar VRM to a GTX 590, except the 690 is significantly more power efficient. So the previously grossly inadequate VRM is now suddenly pretty acceptable. Yeah, so 690s, like, I wonder if, like, people either just don't vault mod these, because I'm assuming that these being dual-core NVIDIA cards, probably a really low power limit, probably no real voltage control in the software. Yeah, I mean, here we have a card that's doing 1300, which is like, this is the kind of thing I'd expect these to be hitting, and then we have the rest of the ranking, so... Still, Chipsy, did bring a 5950X and managed to push 130,000 points in the CPU score. And so that sort of carried his 690 to the top of the 3D Mark Vantage performance rankings. Now, ultimately, to a lot of people, this might sound really silly because it's like, but isn't Vantage supposed to be a GPU benchmark? And, well, yes, but I think it's cool that you get to revisit these old cards every time a new CPU launches. Because the GTX 690, in my opinion, is far more interesting to overclock than, well, most modern GPU releases. Because these things actually scale with voltage on like reasonable cooling systems, which actually 6900 XTs do kind of too. You know, 6900 XTs are ridiculously expensive, so still 690s are kind of more interesting in that sense. It's like you could arguably like bin several of these in order to try find the best one as well. But yeah, still. And then also I just like the sort of like I'm just a big fan of dual core cards because of like similar to how I like big multi GPU setups. These are kind of like ridiculous, like really ridiculous because it's just like so cram two cards, cram literally because you need basically two cards worth of components crammed onto one card, right? Which has a lot of design challenges, and that's a big part of why a lot of the dual core cards actually have horrible power delivery, especially the GTX 590. That's the worst example, along with I think the single board 295X GTX 295. Yeah, which I've never looked at that card myself, but I've like actually no, I think I've seen PCB pictures and I think it runs a 3-phase V-core. So, you know, that should give you some idea of how like these cards are just weird and wacky, and I really wish they got more attention. So, you know, yeah, this is definitely getting carried pretty hard by the 5950X, but I won't say no to a GTX 690 top score just because GTX 690s are cool. Mostly because they're not GTX 590s, which are kind of cool in the sort of like a fire hazard way. So these are like actually properly, like somewhat more properly designed than GTX 590s are. Actually, I think these might technically be better than reference GTX 680s in terms of power delivery, but I've not really done that comparison. Anyway, so congratulations to Chipsy on the very fast 5950X and the somewhat quick GTX 690. And let's move on to the next score. Also, I do have a 690, so I might I need to vault mod that thing. Yeah, I have way too many GPUs to get around to working on. Anyway, next score. Sebi 9123 3D Mark Time Spy, second place on the RX 6900 XT, doing 2883 on the core, 2120 on the memory, and let's actually check what kind of average clocks he's getting. Yeah, 2729. Now, in my experience, even this hasn't been super accurate. The thing about a lot of modern boost architectures is that they, for whatever reason, the software monitoring doesn't seem to work super accurately for the clock speeds. But still, you know, this card is the second fastest 6900 XT to ever run 3D Mark Time Spy. Yeah, accompanied by a 5950X doing 4.923 gigahertz. The CPU score here is a bit low. I think it's because he's pushing his Infinity Fabric too far. I actually spent quite a bit of time like trying to optimize my 5950X for Time Spy. And Time Spy is actually quite sensitive to memory stability and also just memory performance in general. So what I found, at least with my 5950X, was that at 2000 FCLK, I just wasn't getting the scores to, like, the score wasn't as high as if I was at 1900 with, like, tighter timings. But still, yeah, I don't know, like, so that might be something worth looking into. However, the 6900 XT here is absolutely flying, and it is just on air cooling. This is a ASRock OC formula, so that's not too surprising. The heatsink on this thing is ridiculous. And I'm guessing this doesn't involve a Elmore EVC2, which I guess makes sense. At the same time, I would really... Or does it? There's a suspicious green cable over here. Maybe he was good about the cable management and snuck it under the backplate. Or maybe this is just like a good-looking picture before all of the modifications occurred. Though at the same time, I would totally understand if he just didn't want to modify a 6900 XT, as they are very, very expensive, of course. Yeah, also, Google, could you, like, not do this to pictures, please? That would be much appreciated. Still, though, card's absolutely flying, you know, through Time Spy, second fastest 6900 XT. And then also the 5950X doing 4.9 gigahertz on on a custom, I'm assuming a pretty normal custom loop, right? Yeah, no water chiller, so that is a very heavy overclock. And the time spice CPU test is relatively heavy. It's not exactly like, it's harder to run than Firestrike is the easiest way to put it, yeah. And then the rest of the system, we have a B550 Unify X, dual rank Samsung B die. So, yeah, a very sort of, like, if I was putting together, like, the ultimate AMD system, this actually looks a lot like it. Like, 5950X on a B550 Unify X, okay. Dual rank Samsung B die, yep. 6900 XT OC formula. There's not really any other options for a 6900 XT. At least, you know, if you actually care about the PCB. Because obviously, if you just want a 6900 XT, you can get a Red Devil Ultimate, and that's sort of the cheapest way to get one of those. But if you want a card that actually has a significantly upgraded power delivery system, it doesn't get better than the OC formula. So, yeah, just sort of... I approve of these hardware choices, and also a very solid score in 3D Mark's time spy. So congratulations to Sebi on that. And let's move on to the next score, which is IceBear 798's PieFast top score for the Xeon X5650. Second place at 5.6 gigahertz on a cascade phase change cooling system, running on a Rampage 3 Black Edition, which I've been told is basically the best X58 motherboard ever. Unfortunately, also a kind of rare X58 motherboard, as it came out really late into the X58 like life cycle, and was also probably very expensive. Ooh, it's got a prodlyzer for the memory output filtering. Wait, they made prodlyzers in high enough voltage ratings to be put on the memory VRM? Really? Like, they're pretty normal for vCore, but on memory? Like... Anyway, those are basically really fancy SMD capacitors that have, like, crazy low ESR, crazy low ESL. The idea behind them was that you could, like, put them behind... where... Like, if you look at a GPU and you see all the multi-layer ceramics directly behind the core, the idea behind prodlyzers like that is that they could be put there and replace all the multi-layer ceramics. In practice, that turned out to be a terrible idea because those things have a horrible thermal endurance. So putting them directly behind a hot GPU core tends to kill them. So very, very quickly. You just, like, these things, if I'm not mistaken, were only ever manufactured rated to 85 degrees Celsius for 2,000 hours. For comparison, your regular, like, cheapo through-hole polymers, those are rated to, like, 105 degrees for, well, at least 2,000 hours, but most manufacturers these days will use 5,000 hour rated capacitors for even, like, the low-end motherboards and low-end GPUs. So, you know, yeah, having a 2,000 hour, out like capacitor 2000 hour at 85 degrees capacitor sitting directly behind a GPU core, which regularly gets up to 85 degrees. Terrible idea. But on a motherboard in the memory system, that's actually a pretty reasonable place to put one. So yeah, that's neat. I didn't even know this board came with that. There are X58 motherboards that use them in the like output filtering, the EVGA X58 classified. And then we have a mismatched set of what I'm assuming is Elpida hypermemory. It is, yeah, that's running almost DDR3 2000, like that's almost doing 2000 megabits per second at 67618. So that's got to be Elpida Hyper, 1T command rate, dual rank memory, by the way. Elpida Hyper is a 1 gigabit memory chip, so a 2 gig stick will actually have 2 ranks of it. And yeah, PieFast is one of those old... Like, I've heard that this benchmark is actually so easy to run that it's harder to open up CPU-Z than it is to... Or is it save CPU-Z? One of the two. Yeah, basically, CPU-Z is harder than PieFast on system stability. So this is I believe, a single-core, very old, single-threaded benchmark. I don't know if it particularly cares about memory settings, but I do know that it's like very capable of running at very, very high clock speeds. So the screenshot here, we have the CPU actually downclocked a bit. Or there's a mistake in the submission. One of the two. Let's just check. Yeah, no, 5634 makes a lot of sense because they're like he's beating a score that's at 5757. So, yeah, very, very impressive score, you know, out of the also just the fans freaking everywhere. Um, yeah, so a cool setup and also a, you know, impressive score. Unfortunately, in a benchmark that I don't know very much about because and I don't even know why. Like it is called Pi Fast because it does run very fast. It finishes in, you know, 15 seconds and 10 milliseconds. So this would be right up my alley. Um, but I believe this is also one of those benchmarks that kind of cares a lot about the operating system you're running it on. And I don't have much patience for that, for dealing with that kind of thing. So that might explain why I've not really run this very much. Or it's just one of those benchmarks that I keep forgetting about. There's a lot of benchmarks on HWbot, so yeah, but still a very impressive score from the X5650 here. Um, and yeah, so congratulations to Ice Bear on taking second place in the PiFast rankings for the X5650 Xeon. And let's move on to the next score, which is AKM's 3D Mark Vantage Extreme on the... Oh, whoa, this is a Hall of Fame card. Damn it, why don't you have a system picture? I wonder where... There's actually several variants of the GTX 980 Ti Hall of Fame. Some of them are way cooler than others. There's a pretty normal one with I think an 8-phase V-core, but there's a ridiculous one with a 16-phase V-core. I really wonder which one this is, but either way, 3D Mark Vantage Extreme. So this is a new benchmark. Like this benchmark has only recently been added to like getting points. And so there's not really too much competition in the GeForce GTX 980 Ti rankings just yet. And so AKM here, you know, took first place with the GTX 980 Ti at 1531 on the core, 2103 on the memory, with an 11900K doing 5.2 gigahertz. And yeah, 50,000 points GPU score, 91,000 points CPU score. Kind of makes me wonder if you could take a 5950X to this. Because that GPU score is pretty low. Because the funny thing about Vantage, especially Vantage Performance, is with a lot of the really like fast modern cards, you end up very CPU bottlenecked in the GPU portion of the test. So you end up requiring like a really high IPC CPU to get a good GPU score. But 50,000 points, at least at a glance, like this seems to be running at like sub 200 FPS on average, which makes me think, wouldn't a higher core count CPU do a better job here than an 11900K? Because this benchmark scales up to 16 threads, and like, yes, technically an 11900K has 16 threads, but you know what's better than having 16 threads? Having 16 very real cores. So, yeah, still, for now, AKM is at the top of the GTX 980 Ti rankings for Vantage Extreme. I'm assuming we're hoping, like, I'd like to see more competition in these rankings for, like, well, all cards, really. Like, it's a real shame that there's a lot of, like, benchmark rankings where there's just not much competition because when the card came out, the benchmark wasn't, like either the benchmark isn't relevant to the GPU or the GPU isn't or the benchmark wasn't relevant when the GPU was available. So like a lot of cards that can technically run Firestrike are not actually like there's not a lot of scores in the Firestrike rankings for them because Firestrike came out way after the GPU was released and by then nobody cared about running, you know, like say running Firestrike on a 6000 series AMD card doesn't really make much sense because Firestrike was released way after the 6000 series and by that I mean HD 6000 not RX 6000. I just realized, wait a minute. There's technically two 6000 series, but yeah, anyway, still a, you know, quite an impressive score from AKM here in the 980 Ti, well, 980 in the Vantage Extreme 980 Ti rankings. And hopefully we see more competition in that because, yeah, since this only got recently added, unlike like if you look at the 3D Mark Vantage performance rankings for the 980 Ti, that's all like LN2 top scores because, yeah, Vantage was a very, it's even now, it's still a very popular benchmark and I'm a big fan of it. It's a cool benchmark. So... yeah, hopefully we see more competition in the Vantage rankings. Actually, I think somebody else had the idea of running. Oh no, that's a 9900K. I know nothing about 98. Oh, I think it's just a difference in the. Oh yeah, this guy's reporting his GPU clock here, whereas AKM is actually reporting his boost clock, which is so annoying about NVIDIA GPUs. Actually, about boost, are like anything with boost, it's just like, what clock was it actually running at? Does anybody know? With 980 Ti's, it wasn't that bad. It's so much worse on the newer cards, especially on the AMD side. NVIDIA's boost algorithm is actually somewhat more, or at least it reports more cleanly to software than AMD does. Maybe internally the clocks aren't quite what the software claims, but you don't get that like 3D Mark where you have like average clock versus peak clock and like a huge gap between them potentially. So anyway, let's move on to the next score, which is Yosarian lives. Man, this is a horrible name. Yoss's Aquamark. Let's just go with that. I'm just gonna like most people refer to Yoss as Yoss, so we're just gonna call him Yoss. So Yoss's Aquamark, on the Intel GMA 4500, which is an integrated chipset GPU. So it's not built into the CPU, it's built into the chipset because that's where integrated GPUs lived back in the day when you still had a Northbridge, because this is LGA 775. So the GPU would live, I believe, in the Northbridge. Yeah, that makes most sense. It would, or maybe, wait, I don't actually know. This is one of those, like, unfortunate, LGA 775 is extremely popular on HWbot, but it is one of those platforms that I've personally decided I am not getting into this. It's way too, like, this is the platform where you like need to bin your CPUs, bin your motherboards, and then there's like a huge variety of different motherboards that are viable, and it's just like, no. That sounds like no. Um, I mean, it sounds like fun, but I have like I already like I'm way more into GPUs, and I already have too many of those. I don't need to get myself a massive stack of 775. But either way, this is an old integrated graphics card. Um, an Aquamark is a very old benchmark. This benchmark's actually kind of funny because if I remember correctly, this has a fixed number of frames that need to get rendered. So the faster your system is, the shorter the benchmark is. So it's a lot like a CPU benchmark in that sense, right? Most CPU benchmarks are like, hey, complete this many calculations, and then whoever finishes fastest, like a render, like a Cinebench, right? The bigger your score, the faster you finish Cinebench, or a SuperPi where your score is better the faster you finish the benchmark. Well, Aquamark does a very similar thing to that, where the faster your system is, the quicker it finishes. And anyway, unfortunately, I know nothing about integrated LGA 775 GPUs, though I assume, like most integrated GPUs, it is bottlenecked by memory settings, though this thing seems to run only DDR2, so I guess that really limits what kind of memory frequencies are possible and what kind of memory bandwidth is achievable, as of course DDR3 would be faster. That's kind of the reason why we have DDR3, was to be faster than DDR2. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a system picture, but we do know that it was run on single-stage phase change, which makes me very confused because I'm pretty sure the GPU is inside the chipset. Yeah. Yeah, like, the GPU-Z says it's in the chipset, so I'm gonna go with the GPU's in the chipset. Is the chipset on phase change? I guess we'll never know, which is a shame. The CPU's literally at stock clocks because the iGPU is so... Actually, is the CPU underclocked? That looks like he underclocked the CPU, which I guess makes sense because Aquamark is very old, and he's also running it on the iGPU. So, like, Aquamark is older than LGA 775, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very old benchmark. Then again, I don't know how old 775 is, so maybe I shouldn't say that. They might be about the same age. I don't know why I tried to include this really old hardware in these. Well, why I like obscure hardware like this? Because it's like, well, it's a cool, like, it's the fastest GMA, 4500 ever in Aquamark. It's just that I am very confused as to what is... Actually, this is massively faster than the previous top scores. Okay, I'm actually going to click... Why do none of these people have system pictures? I want to see what the hell a GMA 4500 setup looks like. Like... Apparently just no. It is top secret as to what motherboards these GPUs come with, and so nobody takes pictures of them. No, yeah. I guess some of these scores are also just insanely old. Yeah, well, this one's from 2009. Wait, it's a laptop. But it says LGA 775. That's a CPU sock. No, this is... Oh, right, because it's in the chipset. So they could have shoved this... Wait. GM40... Wait a minute. Wait a... Is this a laptop chipset? I am super no, because that's an E5800. That's not a laptop CPU. Yeah, and it's LGA, so... I wish we had a motherboard readout. But unfortunately, so not only is the GMA 4500 extremely old, and I know nothing about it, the people who run these things don't want to share any information. Like, I just want to know what the damn motherboard looks like. Oh well, still though, y'all absolutely smashed the record. Like, by 4,000 points. And it really looks like he's underclocking his CPU, which I'm guessing is so just so that he can run more FSB so that the GPU gets clocked higher, or to get the memory higher. Because ultimately, like, even though an E5800 is very old, and like Aquamark's also really old, and this GPU has to be like snail speed. So you could you can underclock the CPU and it won't affect the benchmark, because the benchmark, like if the GPU takes forever to render a frame, then you don't really need a lot of CPU performance to feed the GPU. Yeah, I'm super confused about this score. I should have asked y'all for more details. I didn't realize that this would be such a mess until we got to it. Still though, like, congratulations to Yoss on, like, absolutely smashing the Aquamark GMA 4500 record. Like, he really did. Like, that's a massive increase in the score. It's just that I wish I knew anything about this. Because currently all I know is that whatever he did worked really well. I just what did he do though? So yeah, congratulations to Yoss on being a GMA 4500 wizard. And that is it for this week's HWbot score roundup. And I managed to make it an hour and 3 minutes long again. Good job, me. Good, really great job. Well, yeah, so congratulations to, everybody who, well, made it into the roundup, and also some of the people, like, and a lot of the people who didn't make it. There was a lot of really, like, high scores. It's just, we can't include all of them. So, yeah, that is it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I've got a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. It would be much appreciated if you check out the Patreon and or the Teespring, as they help out immensely with running the channel. So, yeah, and that is it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.